Again, good evening. My name is Skip Hudson, and I am the Director of Multicultural Affairs here at West Chester University. And it is indeed my pleasure to welcome you to what I'm sure will be a very stimulating and enlightening evening with our speaker, Tim Wise. I would like to extend a very special welcome to our friends from Ursinus College who came by bus to enjoy the presentation this evening. It was almost 1 year ago when a discussion with Dr. Adele Solak, I suggested that we bring Mr. Wise to our campus to help advance discussions about some of the issues that were uncovered during our recent campus climate survey. With her leadership and the work of Dr. Jackie Hodes and Ms. Querida Lugo, we were successful in securing a grant through the University Forum to help fund tonight's program. Tonight's presentation is a kickoff event for a series of discussions under the title of the Understanding Privilege Project. There will be 4 subsequent sessions throughout this academic year, each addressing a different aspect of privilege. We will begin as a follow-up to this program on October the 14th with a session on white privilege, followed in November on the 18th by a session on cisgender privilege. Next semester, our first session on ability privilege will be in February the 17th, and we'll conclude our series in March the 23rd, with a session on heterosexual privilege. Please look for the posters advertising these sessions, and as always, they are free and open to the public. Before we get to the introduction of tonight's speaker, I'd like to thank those who have helped make this program possible. First, I'd like to thank Adele Solak, Jackie Hodes, and Querida Lugo for their work in planning and implementing this evening's presentation, as well as the discussions to follow. I would also like to thank our sponsors, the Campus Climate Intervention Team, the Division of Student Affairs, the LGBTQA Services, Office of Multicultural Affairs, the Office of Residence Life, Office of Social Equity, the University Forum, and the Women's Center. You may have noticed that we have a limited number of Mr. Wise's books for sale in the lobby. He will also be available to sign his books at the conclusion of his presentation. After he finishes with his presentation in here, we will have a short period of question and answer, and we will have microphones available for that. And finally, to introduce tonight's guest, it is my pleasure to invite Ms. Angelica Rivera Ortiz to the podium. Angelica is a third-year political science international relations major. She has been a very active member of our university community for the past 3 years and currently serves as the Multicultural Senator for the Student Government Association. Please welcome Angelica Rivera Ortiz.
Give me a second. Tim Wise is among one of the most predominant anti-racist writers and educators in the United States. Recently named one of the 25 visionaries who are changing your world by Utne Reader, Wise has spoken in 49 states and over 60 college campuses to community groups across the nation. He has also lectured internationally in Canada and Bermuda on issues of comparative racism, racism in education, racism in religion, and racism in the labor market. Wise is the author of 5 books, including White Like Me, Reflections on Race for a Privileged Son, Affirmative Action, Racial Preferences in White and Black, Speaking Treason Fluently, Anti-Racist Reflections from an Angry White Man, Between Barack and a Hard Place, Racism and White Denial in the Age of Obama, and his latest, Colorblind, The Rise of Post-Racial Politics and Retreat for Racial Equity. He has contributed essays to 25 books and is one of several persons featured in White Men Changing Racism, 35-Person Stories from Duke University Press. He received the 2001 British Diversity Award for Best Featured Essays on Racial Issues, and his writings have appeared in dozens of popular, professional, and scholarly journals. Wise has provided anti-racism training to teachers nationwide and has conducted training for physical and medical industry professionals on how to combat racist equality in the healthcare system. He has also trained corporate, government, entertainment, military, and law enforcement officers on methods of dismantling racism and racism in their institutions, and has served as a consultant for plaintiff attorneys in federal discrimination cases in New York and Washington. Without further ado, please help me with a round of applause to introduce Tim Wise.
Thank you very much. It's a really nice crowd. So I'm going to conclude one of two things as a result of the size of this crowd. Either one is fine by me, but I'm just going to tell you what my two theories are, and we'll see which one is true. Either number one, there is an incredible amount of interest in the subject of racism and institutional inequality and white racial privilege and oppression here at Westchester. That's theory number one. Or theory number two is that extra credit still counts for something in the halls of higher education. Either one of those is fine. I will tell you that regardless of whether you are here because of an intense interest in the subject matter or whether you are here because a professor suggested to you that it might be a really great way to pad a grade, the reality is that regardless of your motivation, you're here and I'm here, and the lights, although dim, are bright enough for me to notice if you get up to leave, and I am not above calling you out if you choose to do so. So it might be advisable for you to just sort of hang out. It's only going to be an hour. It won't be too painful. Maybe, at least, it won't be. Depends on your perspective, I suppose. Anyway, it is good to be here and to see some old friends in the audience. I don't mean by that to suggest that you are aged. I just mean that I have known you for a while. That's all I mean by old friends, and also hopefully to make some new ones, and to talk about an issue that I know, even though we ought to by now in this country have gotten to be relatively good at it, because it's certainly an issue that has been around for long enough. We are not, in fact, very good when it comes to having a discussion about the issues of race and racism and privilege and inequality. And I know it's not really easy for anyone. It's not really a conversation that anyone wants to have. People of color don't really want to have this conversation, particularly with white folks, because they know that to engage the conversation around the issue of race and racism is to risk being routinely dismissed, diminished, having their opinions ignored, or written off to self-interest. That is to say that they know full well too oftentimes those of us who are white will ignore them and conclude that they are simply playing a race card, making a mountain out of a molehill and exaggerating the problem, so they don't want to talk about it, frankly, as you can understand. And those of us who are white, we don't want to talk about it for a different reason, right? We don't want to engage the conversation around race and racism, whether it is race and racism on a college campus or in the larger society we share, for a couple of reasons. Number one, we're deathly afraid we're going to say the wrong thing. We're deathly afraid, desperately concerned that if we engage this conversation, we're going to say the wrong thing and people of color are going to think that we're racist. Oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. We can't talk about this. They might think we're racist. Okay, newsflash. All right, they already think we might be, so just get over that. And here's another news flash based on academic research. You know what's really ironic is the academic research says the very thing that convinces black and brown folk that we might be racist is our silence on this issue. It's almost like black and brown folk look at us and we don't want to engage on it, and they say, I know why you're not talking, because you're hiding something. See? So if we really want to just create community, we have to just take a risk and take a chance and have the conversation. That would actually do more to disabuse folks of the assumption that we're trying to avoid the conversation because of some pernicious racial bias than having the conversation and maybe screwing up. Having the conversation and screwing up is better than remaining silent and reinforcing the notion that the reason we don't want to engage is because we, in fact, are hiding some stuff, you see. So it's better to just take a chance, but a lot of times we're not ready for that. Too afraid. There's another reason white folks don't want to talk about race, and that is that we're deathly afraid folks are going to try to make us feel guilty about the history of this country. Oh my God, I wasn't here. I didn't do all that. That was a long time ago. That was before I was born. Yeah, well, so was July 4th of 1776, but y'all still celebrate that every damn year. Right? So the stuff that's in the past that we want to remember, we make a point of talking about it. We make a point of commemorating it when it makes us look good, when it makes us feel good. We just have a different standard when it comes to the stuff that makes us feel a little inadequate, brings us up a little bit short. Then all of a sudden the past becomes a trifle. You know, it becomes a pimple on the ass of now. Like we don't have to talk about it or think about it because it's irrelevant. Why would we bring that up? So we're afraid, we don't want to feel guilty. Well, we're going to deal with that real quickly up front before I get into anything else tonight. This is not about guilt. I do not want any person who is white to walk out of this auditorium feeling like my point was to come beat them up because they're white. Your eyes do not deceive you. I am white. I am not interested in beating up white folks. I love me some white folks. Let's be clear, because folks get deathly confused on this point. They think he hates white people. He hates himself. No, I love me some white people. I love white people. My wife is white. My two daughters are white, which that happens when white people make babies. My mama is white. My dad is white. Now, we don't get along, but that's not because he's white. That's in spite of that. It's about some other stuff. We don't have time to get into what that's really about this evening, but so it isn't about white people. This is a conversation about whiteness as an institutional force, as a mindset, as an ideology. It's not about guilt. It's really about responsibility, and those are two very different things. We take responsibility as a culture, as a society, for the world as we find it, not necessarily because we are to blame for the world as we find it, but because we simply find it as it is and have to make do and decide how we're going to bear that reality, having inherited as such. And this isn't really a radical concept. Just to make the point of how not radical the concept is, I'm going to tell you a story to sort of illustrate the point as a metaphor for the larger argument I'm trying to make. This story has nothing to do with race or racism at all. That's how easy we're going to ease into this conversation, see. It's a conversation, though, that I think makes a point about race and racism indirectly, and it's a story about something that happened to me when I graduated from college, which was 21 years ago this past May. I graduated in May of 1990 from Tulane University in New Orleans, Louisiana. And upon graduating, made the decision, for reasons that I really cannot understand, that it would be a really great idea to move into a very large house with 9 other people. I'd like to give you a little bit of life advice. And if you do not remember another thing I say tonight, that would be a shame, because I have a lot more. But if you do not remember another damn thing that I say this evening, for the love of God, write this down, tweet this to yourself, put this on your Facebook wall, never to be removed for any reason. It is the single most important piece of wisdom I will impart to you this evening. Here it is. Listen closely. Never should you come to the conclusion, for any reason, no reason at all, that it would be a good idea to live in a very large house with 9 other people. Because it will not be a good idea. It will be a terrible idea. And I don't care if you try to make it political by calling it a co-op. It doesn't matter. You can call it whatever you like. It is not going to be a co-op. It is going to be a big, nasty-ass house with 10 people living in it. And that is all. And that is what I came to understand. But I thought it was going to be a really good idea, as did the other 9 people, because we all thought to ourselves, hey, you know what? We're broke, which, newsflash, when you graduate from college, that's what's coming, just letting you know. So we were broke, and we thought, well, at the very least, 10 people, when you're broke, you can save some money. And on that level, we were not far from accurate. We were pretty right on that. 10 people, rent was like $525 a month. I don't mean per person, I mean total, right? Not good at math, man, but I can do that math. That is $5,250 per person per month. I know some of y'all don't remember 1990, and that makes me very sad. But let me just assure you, that even in $1990, that was really good. $5,250, you add the utility bills, the cable bill, all of that stuff, it was still less than $100 a month per person. So we figured, hey, we don't even have to like each other. Man, we can just suffer for 6, 8, 10 months, and we'll have enough money saved up, we can get our own damn place. It doesn't matter, We'll just suffer for a little while. But about 8 weeks or so into this little experiment in communal living, I came to understand why I'd made a terrible mistake. And this is how I learned it. I came home one night from work. I was working downtown in New Orleans and living uptown, got off the streetcar, walked 5 or 6 blocks into my neighborhood on Robert Street, walked up the stairs, the big yellow house with the 10 people living in it, 1805 Robert. I opened the door. I was met by the incredible smell of dinner being prepared for the whole house by one of the roommates on the left front burner of the stove. It was a big pot of gumbo, man, because it's New Orleans and that's what you do, okay? Man, it looked good. And it smelled good. It even had shrimp in there. Not many. Like I said, we were broke, but there were 3. 3 of those really little bitty ass shrimp. Those shrimp that are so tiny that they make popcorn shrimp look like jumbo shrimp. They make jumbo shrimp look like lobsters. And I know some of y'all are very familiar with these shrimp because you are students and they are the only shrimp that you can afford. In fact, I really don't think they're even shrimp. I think it's just like shrimp flakes or shrimp dust or seasoning or something. They just throw in there, make you think you had seafood gumbo, you know, make you feel like you're more affluent than you really are, you know. But it smelled great. And when my roommate asked me if I wanted some, I was very tempted, but I had to say no because, as it turned out, I'd had dinner that evening downtown before I left work. So I didn't know he was making gumbo. If I'd known, maybe I'd have waited. But I didn't know, so I hadn't waited. And I told him, look, do me a favor. Just take some of it and put it in the fridge, in some Tupperware, whatever. I'll take it to lunch tomorrow to work because it looks great. He said, great, I'll do that. So I said, fine, and I went upstairs, and I hung out with the roommates, and I did whatever it is we did back in 1990. There wasn't a hell of a lot to do, you know, back in the old days. Social networking, you pretty much just walk down the hall to your roommate's room. You're like, hey, what you doing? Nothing? Okay, then I'm just going to go to sleep. Like, that is sort of what we did. It wasn't a whole lot more. I'm exaggerating, but not by much. It was pretty bad back in those days. You didn't have a lot to do. You had to be creative, play with wood toys or whatever it is we had to do, you know. So I sort of went to bed early, woke up that next day about 20 minutes after 7, came downstairs to get my coffee to get ready for work, and I noticed that on the left front burner of the stove, right where it had been 12 hours earlier, was the same pot of gumbo. It did not smell or look as good as it had the night before. I was unhappy for a couple of reasons. Number one, the roommate had not saved any portion of it for me as he had promised, and I certainly was not going to eat it now, so the food had gone to waste. Number two, he'd left the mess, you know, for somebody else, maybe me, to clean up. I was not pleased, but I decided, you know what, I got like 15 minutes before I got to get on the streetcar and go to work, so what the hell, I'm just going to clean it, and I'm going to take it up with him later. We're going to have a conversation when I get back from work, but for now, I will clean the mess. So I grabbed the pot of gumbo, brought it over to the sink, got the scrub brush, the sponge, the soap, poured the soap inside the pot of nasty, crusted, disgusting gumbo, started to run the water, and just before I let the water go into the pot of gumbo, I stopped myself and I said, wait a minute, I don't have to do this. I didn't make this mess. Hell, I didn't even eat any of this mess. Now I felt really self-righteous, you know, because I'm talking myself out of doing the hard work, which is a skill I learned in college. So I'm like, I don't have to do this, and I can come up with 15 different philosophical justifications for why I am not going to do it. I felt really good about that, put the pot right back where I found it, went off to work, came back that night 20 minutes after 6, noticed that one of my other roommates was making dinner for the evening on the right front burner of the stove. But on the left front burner, right where it had been now for a full 24 hours, was the same pot of increasingly disgusting gumbo, getting worse and nastier by the minute. I looked at my roommate and I said, now hold on just a second. How is it that you can make dinner for us on the right front burner of the stove when I'm fairly confident you can smell last night's dinner because it's right there? Why don't you clean that? He said, hey man, wasn't here for dinner last night. I didn't even get back till 11 o'clock. I didn't have any of this gumbo. Did you have any of the gumbo? He said to me with an accusing finger, and I said, hey man, not me. He said, well, neither did I. Now, we both felt self-righteous, for we both knew what our protestations of innocence meant. It meant we were not cleaning the gumbo. He said, do you want some lentils and rice? And I said, self-righteously, yes. As a matter of fact, I would. And I ate my dinner. I cleaned the plate. I put it in the dish rack to dry. Went upstairs, did some work I was behind on, watched TV or whatever, went to bed sort of early. 7 o'clock in the morning came, and I had forgotten to set an alarm. But here's a tip. Trust me when I tell you, if you were living in a house where a pot of gumbo has been sitting on the left front burner of your stove for what is now 36 and a half hours, you are not going to need an alarm clock to wake your ass up. Because the smell is going to crawl out of the pot of gumbo on the legs that it grew overnight. and no English majors. I am not speaking in metaphor. I mean that literally, that the stench is going to grow legs and feet and crawl up out of the pot, across the kitchen, across the living room, up the back stairs, down the back hall, go under your door frame and find with the precision of a laser that thing on the front of your face that you call a nose, and you will be awake. And now I was none too happy because I knew what was waiting for me on the left front burner of that stove, having not been cleaned by anybody, least of all the guy that made the mess. So I throw my door open. I'm angry. I start stomping down the hall, just daring any of my roommates to say a word to me about this. I live with 9 other people, can't find one of them. And the guy that made the gumbo, it's like, where's Waldo? Nobody knows where in the hell he went. It's like he made the gumbo as a practical joke just to see how long it would take for one of us to clean the mess, and then he skipped town. So I get down to the bottom of the stairs, look across the living room into the kitchen, I see the pot of gumbo, and I'm confident, even though it has been over 2 decades since that the gumbo saw me. And it was at that moment, not a moment earlier, but most certainly not a moment later, that I came to understand the most important lesson that I had ever learned in or out of a classroom and about any subject, not just household cleanliness. And the lesson was this, and y'all have been real patient waiting for it, so here it comes. The lesson was, it didn't really matter any longer, did it, whether I was the one who had made the mess. Didn't really matter any longer whether I was, as the old saying goes, the author of all this unpleasantness. The only thing that mattered was what? That I was tired of living in the funk. That I was tired of living in the nastiness and the residue of somebody else's actions, actions in which I had not been implicated and for which I was not to blame, but actions that were having an effect on my environment every minute, every second, every hour, every day, that I did not do something about them. And the same is true with human society. When we get tired of living in the funk, when we get tired of living with the residue of what others have done in our name, with or without our permission or involvement, we will clean it. Not because we are to blame for it, but because we're the only ones left. That's a difference between guilt and responsibility. Guilt is what you feel for the stuff that you've done, and responsibility is what you take because of the kind of person that you are. They are not, strictly speaking, synonymous. We take responsibility for the world or our own home as we find it. And when we talk about the legacy of racial inequity in our country, just like class inequity, gender inequity, or inequity on a whole lot of different levels of identity, we have inherited a very mean and torturous legacy indeed. And it's one that we have to be able to talk about. We have to be willing to talk about. We have to be able to grapple with and disagree about, but at least to contemplate. We probably have always needed to do it, but no more so than now, because the reality is, as demographers will tell you, within the next 20 years, maybe 25 at the outside, this is a country that is going to be roughly 50% people of color and 50% white folks. Now, you don't have to like that. I don't much care whether you like it. Right? It doesn't matter how you feel about it. It is a fact. I realize there are some white folks in Arizona who are trying to stop that, right, and aren't real happy about it. What I also know about white folks in Arizona is their average age is about 137. So with a little patience and some decent community organizing, we can probably outlast them. Reality is, this country is changing, and you can either be ready for that, and you can deal with that, and you can try to create equity before that change is truly upon us. So you can sit around and act like it doesn't matter, but I assure you, if we don't figure out how to talk about the persistent racial inequities that we have inherited and which continue to plague us, some of which I will talk about in a second, we are going to get to that day in maybe 2030, 2035, 2040 at the outside, and be a highly dysfunctional country for all people, not just people of color, but white folks. And yet we're being warned we can't talk about this. We're being told there's no need to talk about it. We're being told that this conversation I want us to have is so 2007, you know. Because don't you know, Tim, that in 2008, like, this big thing happened, like we elected a black dude president, so it's all done. Because how in the world could we still have a racism problem and a black guy become president? How could there still be white privilege and a man of color become president? Okay, I don't know, let's think about that. Let's think about it logically as opposed to emotionally, and let's think about why it is highly possible for an individual of color to obtain that level of power and prestige and still have a system of racial inequity. If I were to suggest to you that women and girls in Pakistan and India and Israel and Great Britain and the Philippines all had equal opportunity now, and that sexism and patriarchal oppression of women had been obliterated in those places. Why? Because they all had had female heads of state. And that was my only damn evidence, is that a woman had obtained the pinnacle of political power in all 5 of those places, and therefore that women and girls had fully equal opportunity in those places, and sexism was no longer a problem. I hope you would throw something at me, because that would be the most asinine thing I could possibly say. The idea that women and girls in those countries have equal opportunity, and the evidence is the fact that women happen to obtain the highest political positions in those countries, makes no sense. The experience of millions of women, millions of members of a subordinated group, the idea that they now are no longer subordinated just because of the accomplishments of individuals within that group, does not follow, any more so than it follows here with regard to race. But that is what we are being told. And unfortunately, to some extent, we're being told it not just by the right, who has its own, perhaps, motivations for not wanting to talk about race, but also by the nominally liberal left, at least the nominally liberal white left, which also doesn't really want to talk very much about race. And occasionally, we have that nominally liberal and left white group collaborated with by individuals of color, including this president. I mean, this is a president who, if you recall, the first time that most of us became familiar with him was 2004. It was the Democratic National Convention in Boston. He gave the keynote address, and unless you are from the state of Illinois, there's a very good chance you really had never heard about him, or at least not much, never had really seen him speak or read anything of his. And here he was, he's giving this keynote address, and there was a lot that he said that got applause that night, but there was this one line in particular that I found particularly interesting. And it was the biggest applause line of the night. It's when Barack Obama, then a state senator running for the U.S. Senate, a position he would win later that fall, and now, of course, President of the United States, said, "We're not a white America and a black America and a Latino America and an Asian America. We're just the United States of America." And everybody was like, oh my God. Oh my God. So awesome. I love that line. It's brilliant. Love that. People were clapping and clapping. I mean, it was like the longest sustained applause. It started at 9 o'clock, and 30 minutes later, I'm like, damn, I got to go to bed. So I went to sleep. I woke up the next morning and turned on the Today Show, and people were still like. And once again, I'm exaggerating, but not by a lot. It was a really long applause break. People ate that up. They loved it. And I remember thinking at the time, how is it that a man as intelligent as this, and let me do a little break here for a second. I'm going to come back to it. You'll notice after a while, if you don't know this is like jazz. It's not linear. I'm coming back, but I'm going to go somewhere first. I was worried about how a man this intelligent, because see, even if you don't like President Obama as a president, even if you disagree with his policies, that's fine. You're entitled to that. Even if you didn't vote for him the first time or wouldn't vote for him a second time, regardless, most people, regardless of their politics, are at least willing to acknowledge he's a relatively bright human being. Now, I know there are exceptions to this. People like Donald Trump, who felt the need to question, the president's intelligence back a couple months ago when he was flirting with the idea of running for president until he realized that nobody was going to vote for his ass. And so Donald Trump was like, well, I don't think he probably deserved to get into those Ivy League schools. He probably just sort of got in, in other words, because he was black is the implication. And, we want to see his grade. Well, he graduated magna cum laude from Harvard Law. They don't give that out for shits and giggles. You have to sort of earn that. And I mean, the fact that it was coming from a guy whose daddy gave him $10 million to start his own business, the fact that he would question whether anybody had what they had because they had earned it is the textbook definition of irony, right? And the fact that here's a guy who gladly supported and funded John McCain and Sarah Palin, the first of whom graduated third from the bottom of the Naval Academy class in which he was enrolled, a Naval Academy he wouldn't have been allowed into at all were it not for his daddy being an admiral, and the latter of whom, Sarah Palin, went to 6 schools in 5 years before she finally figured out a way to graduate. The idea that Donald Trump would question anyone's academic credentials, given his own record of who he has supported, is again the textbook definition of irony. But now, that's the end of my sidelight. Back to the lecture. So most people, regardless of how you feel about this president, at least are willing to extend to him the common courtesy of recognizing him that he's not stupid, he's a pretty smart guy. And yet, as I was watching him that night giving that talk, and in the days after, I'm thinking about it, and I'm like, damn, what does it say that a person as intelligent as this, as well-read as this, as erudite as this, as knowledgeable as he is, would stand in front of millions of people and lie to us? Because that's what he did. When he said that we were this United States of America, he didn't say it in the aspirational future tense. He didn't say, if we do blah, 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 we will be a United States. That's one thing. He said it in the descriptive present tense. He said that was who we are now. And the reason I say that's a lie is that this man had to know better. He had to know better. Because that very summer, for example, a report had come out from MIT and the University of Chicago, the latter of which was the school where he had been teaching in the law school. So he probably knew about this report before we did. He was on the listserv, you know. Probably got the study before any of us saw it, which found what? That job applicants with white-sounding names, they don't even know if you're white, man, they just think you might be because of your name, had a 50% greater chance of getting called back for an interview than those with black-sounding names, even when all the qualifications were the same years of experience, same amount of education. In fact, that study found that for black applicants to have the same odds of a callback as white applicants, the black applicants would actually have to have 8 additional years of experience relative to the white applicants just to have the same odds of a callback for an interview. Now that does not sound like a United States of anything. It sounds like a deeply divided country. And this individual, Barack Obama, state senator at the time, candidate for the United States Senate, now president, had to know that, and he couldn't say it. See, if you want to understand just how not post-racial we are, all you have to do is reflect on one very simple question. Do you think that the President of the United States, with all of his power, with all of his prestige, he is the most powerful individual ostensibly in his country, one of the most powerful in the world, do you think he could stand on this stage and say a damn thing that I have said in the 25 minutes or so that I've been out here? And if you think the answer is no, you ought to ask yourself why that is. Because even with all of his power and prestige, he couldn't stand up here and say, and it doesn't even matter, not just could he say it the way I said it. I know I can be more militant, there's no question about that, but he could say it with a smile. He could say it and be giving out lollipops as he said it. He could be giving out like balloons and marshmallows and kisses to babies. And if he said any of what I have been saying, which by the way is not even arguable, like there are some things that I can say that you can disagree with, but history, the history that I've shared thus far and the study about names at MIT and Chicago, that there's not even another opinion to that makes any sense. Like that is inarguable fact. But this president couldn't talk about that. He had to say that we were a united country. The very summer that he gives that speech, the Justice Department is out collecting data, which they would then release in a report in the fall, which found what? That black and Latino men are 2 to 3 times more likely than white men to have their cars stopped and then to be physically searched for drugs, even though white men, on the occasions when we were searched, were 4 times more likely to have the drugs on us. I want to repeat that, because you did not hear that in any news item, print, or broadcast at the time that the report was released. Black and Latino men 2 to 3 times more likely to be suspected and therefore searched. White men 4 times more likely to be guilty on the occasions when we were. That does not sound like a United States of anything. It sounds like a deeply divided nation. Now, in my case, I did not need the Justice Department to tell me where the drugs were, because I could have told you this from personal experience. And I can share this with you now because the statute of limitations has expired. I worked as a community organizer in public housing in New Orleans for 15 months in the mid-1990s. At a time when public housing there was considered by those who rank these things as the most dangerous, the worst, the most criminal, the most drug-infested public housing in the United States. And I will tell you without fear of contradiction, that I saw far fewer drugs in 15 months in that almost entirely black and entirely poor space than I saw on a typical weekend on the 8th floor of Monroe Hall at Tulane University from the fall of 1986 to the spring of 1987. That would be my freshman year. And indeed, I saw fewer drugs in 15 months in public housing than I saw on a typical Saturday night in room 804, which I think was my room. One cannot be sure, but I think that that's right. The point being that this level of division had nothing to do with criminality, it had to do with suspicion, had to do with stereotype, who was suspected, therefore who would be searched, who would be detected, who would be caught, who would be incarcerated, etc. Something that the president, now state senator then, could not have talked about. So he had to know better. And even now he can't talk about these things. I mean, you can sort of get it, like when he's a candidate for stuff, you sort of get it. Like, okay, he's got to play some games when he's a candidate because people don't want to hear about this. And if he talks about it, he's going to make some people angry and they're not going to vote for him. Okay, he won. Okay, he's the president now. The president ought to be able to damn well say anything they want to say. They are the president. And he still can't say it because he risks this volcanic eruption of white backlash if he even brings up the issue. He can't talk about the wealth disparities in this country, which even before the economic meltdown that began 5 years ago and is now really sort of, snowballed into this horrible situation we have right now, even before that, the median wealth, the median net worth for white families was 12 times that of African-American families, 8 times that of Latino families. Now, after the economic collapse, it's 20-to-1 white to black, 18-to-1 white to brown. It's not because we've worked harder, not because we've prayed harder, and surely not because we as white folks possess some superior investment wisdom about which people of color are sorely lacking. I mean, for the love of God, if we have not learned anything else in the last 5 years of global economic meltdown, might we at least learn this, that a handful of rich white men can lose a hell of a lot of money. And they can do it without any help from black people. Without any help from Mexicans, be they documented or not, without any help from Asian Americans or indigenous Native North Americans, just white dudes, and not just white dudes, but like really rich, highly educated, really well-connected, brilliant white dudes, the kind of guys that are so brilliant that they get jobs trading economic instruments called derivatives that they can't even define. God, you got to be smart to pull that off. My God. What's a derivative? I don't know, but I made $1 billion trading them last year. Oh, and then by the way, because I didn't really know what the hell I was doing, I just tanked the economy. Sorry. So in half a decade, this coterie of rich white dudes just destroyed $12 trillion worth of wealth, 20% of the accumulated net worth of this country, which it took over 225 years to accumulate, gone in half a decade because of the work of the brightest guys on Wall Street. And I know there are people who are like, well, now, Tim, why do you have to mention that they're white? Why is that relevant? Here's why. Because if they were black, you can bet your ass we'd have been talking about that. Folks would have said, first of all, just imagine like what would happen if black folks jacked $12 trillion worth of other people's money. Like the whole conversation would be about race, man. It would be, here's how it would sound. And you know this is true if you're honest. This is how it would sound. How did these people even get these jobs? You know how they got these jobs. These black folks were only in those positions because of affirmative action. They only got those positions because they were black, unlike us white guys who got them because our daddy made a phone call. Right, that's the merit system. What are these people getting these jobs? Think about how long it would take for like black street criminals to steal $12 trillion. Like, just try to put that in perspective. You have any idea how long that would take? That'd take like 5 millennia, man. We'd be here for like 5,000 years. And that would take around-the-clock theft. Black folk would have to have their hand in your pocket like 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, 366 on leap year, and 5,000 years later, be like, hey, you got 12 trillion yet? Nope, not yet. I am still working on it. But rich white men took that and lost it in 5 years. And that is talent of a particularly criminal kind. None of them have gone to jail. We got black women going to jail for 20 years for $50 worth of food stamp fraud. You jack $12 trillion, nothing happens to you, but you get bailed out by the United States government. And you get folks that want to just keep giving you tax cuts because you're the real engine of the economy, right? That's the kind of crazy world in which we live right now, right? So this 12-to-1 wealth gap, or 20-to-1, now that the economy's imploded, it's not about skill or talent or investment wisdom or any of that. Man, it's about the fact that for decades, for generations, those of us who are white have had a state that intervened on our behalf. And I want to make this point very clear because we have this mythology we create in this country, and this gets in the way of having an honest conversation about race. This mythology that we're hearing right now, right, particularly from the Tea Party and folks like that, is that government is the problem. We need to get government out of the way. Government is the problem. Government never does anything good. Well, yeah, except for that time when the government gave white folks 245 million acres of free land under the Homestead Act, and like no white people complained about that. Like white folks didn't go, oh no, oh my God, don't give me this ranch, this farm, that'd be like socialism. What the hell are you trying to do to me? I just want to make it in the free market. That's all. The state intervention that's horrible. No, hell no. We loved big government, man, because it was giving us everything. The middle class white community in this country was built by big government. Look at the 1930s and 40s, the FHA program, and then later the VA housing program, which loaned over $120 billion worth of home equity preferentially to white families when people of color could not get those loans because of the underwriting criteria that was being used by government mandate. So by 1960, about half of all white mortgages in the country were being written under these preferential government-subsidized, government-guaranteed programs, without which there is no white middle class. That doesn't mean that white folks weren't working hard, so please, don't get because people always get this twisted and they get confused, like, he's saying that white people didn't work hard. No, man, white folks worked really hard. My great-grandfather came here from Russia in the early part of the 1900s, with the proverbial 37 cents and a ball of lint in his pocket, or whatever it is we say that our ancestors came with, but he also had opportunities immediately off the boat that were off limits to anyone who wasn't from Europe. So even though he was a Jewish immigrant, even though he was despised for his ethnicity, his religion, his culture, his customs, his language, and the lack of English language skills, he still had access to stuff that other people did not. It doesn't mean he didn't work hard. He worked 18 hours a day, all of his life. But his hard work was met with access to an opportunity structure that other people did not have access to, and that made all the difference. That was government intervention, FHA, VA loan, GI Bill, Homestead Act, over and over and over again. Even the Interstate Highway Program, which we don't think of as like a racially preferential program, but who did it allow to move to the suburbs? Who did it, in effect, subsidize to move to the suburbs? White folks were the only ones that could move there. So at the very time these interstates are getting constructed, it's making it possible for white folks to leave the cities where they work, move out to the suburbs, and go back and forth while black and brown folks' houses and communities were being destroyed to make way for those interstates. They're plowing the interstate right through black communities, right through Puerto Rican communities, right through black and brown communities all over this country, destroying 1/5 of all black housing by 1969 to make way for interstates and office parks and shopping malls and parking lots that would be mostly to the benefit of white Americans. That's reverse Robin Hood. That's government acting on behalf of the dominant group. We don't want to talk about that. You see, but if we don't start there, we can't understand how we got here. And yet, we can't talk about it. The president can't talk about the Labor Department data from just last year, which found that black folks with college degrees did everything right, stayed in school, did everything right, twice as likely as white folks with degrees to be out of work. Latino and Asian American folk with college degrees, about 40% more likely than their white counterparts to be out of work. Right now, the median income for a white man who's only 30 years old, on average less than a decade of time in the labor force, the median income for white men who are 30 equals that of the median for black men who are 60 and just about ready to retire. That is not about effort. It is not about talent. It is not about ability. It is not about seniority. It is about something else. And what it is about is a deeply divided nation, a nation about which this president cannot even speak honestly, because even when he doesn't talk about race, folks on the right try to beat him up with race. That's how far behind we are as a country in talking about this. You don't even have to talk about race, and they will still use it against you. So here we have a president who floats this really very weak health care bill, frankly, right? Incredibly weak piece of legislation, and it didn't say anything about racial health disparities in there. There wasn't a word about it. And he didn't talk about the racial health disparities during the debate, but yet the right decided they would use it against him. So like one day in the summer, a couple years back, I remember I'm sitting at home and I'm flipping around channels on the TV, and I don't know what happened. Like, my remote control went dead right when I was on Fox. It was like some crazy voodoo stuff coming through that Roger Ailes put on to the remote, and so I couldn't get off of his channel, you know. And there it was, and there's Glenn Beck, man, and he's just looking right at me, and he says, "Friends," and I'm like, damn, for real? Are we friends, Glenn? You and me? All right, okay. He says, "Friends, do you want to know what the healthcare debate is really about?" And I was so sucked into this, man, it was like, yes, I want to know, Glenn. What is it? And see, I thought I knew. Like, I had a guess. You know, if you had asked me, "Tim, what's the healthcare debate about?" I would have been like, healthcare. But clearly, that is because I'm an idiot who lacks the superior insight of a Glenn Beck, who then proceeded to say, "It's not about healthcare." I'm like, damn. Really? It's not? Do I get another guess? One more guess, please. He said, "I'm going to tell you what it's about." I'm like, "Yes, please stop teasing me. Please talk to me. It's just you and me. We're buddies. Talk to me." He says, "I'll tell you what it's about. It's about this administration trying to get reparations for slavery." Yeah, I didn't see that coming. Right? And I remember thinking to myself, wait, what? Hold on. Trying. I made the mistake of trying to like climb into his brain and see what he sees. It is a scary place. I don't recommend going there, but I did because I desperately wanted to understand what level of, psychotic break would bring about this kind of commentary. And I was trying to envision, like, does he really think this is a reparations bill? Does he think there's like some evil genius black person who's like sitting at home and they're going, damn, how are we going to get these reparations, man? Been working on this 40 acres and a mule thing for like a century and a half, man. How are we going to get this damn Oh my God, I know what we're going to do. And then this evil genius black person picks up their phone and they call all the other black people, 35 million black people, because there's an app for that, and they call all of them. And, just like, okay, for the white folks, there's not really an app for that. And I want to say that because I know there will be some of you who are like, that's not fair. If they had an app for white people, that would be called racism. That's reverse racism. A black app. It's just a joke. There's not really. Anyway, but this image that Glenn Beck is cultivating, right? This idea that some black dude is like, I got it. I know how we're going to get reparations. He calls all the black people. He's like, you want to hear my plan? You want to hear my plan? I got a plan. I know how we're going to get paid. Are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready? Here we go. And everybody's like, yes, please. Will you just tell us? Because we got to get back to work. And he's like, cool. Here it comes. Here it comes. Check it out. Cancer. What? The hell kind of plan is that? What kind of reparations is it you got to get sick to get paid? What the hell kind of scheme is that supposed to be? Doesn't make any sense intellectually. You can hear it. You realize how ridiculous it is. But then I stopped myself trying to intellectualize it. See, that was my mistake, right? Trying to think this through logically was my mistake because it had nothing to do with logic. It was political, and politically it was brilliant. Brilliant. Because what he had just said to millions of people who don't have to know any better, and who by virtue of their sheep-like following of him have demonstrated their inability to think logically about a whole lot of stuff. And yet what he just said to them was, they are coming for your money. And when they get it, they're going to give it to those people. Always remember that. That's what it's all about, taking from you those who work hard and giving to them those who don't. So politically, this meme made sense. It was about racial resentment. It was about pushing a button that didn't have to be logical. And then like a week later, Rush Limbaugh gets in on it because, these guys, they listen to each other. And Limbaugh was like, he was angry that Glenn Beck beat him to that whole healthcare equals reparations thing. You know, he was like, damn, that was good. What am I going to do? I got to top that. 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 Then he comes up with this thing a couple of weeks after where he actually says that President Obama is, and it's a direct quote, merrily presiding over the destruction of America so as to pay white folks back for slavery, end of quote. Yes, of course. This man is purposely trying to destroy the country and the global economy just to get back at Whitey. That makes sense. No, it makes no sense, except politically, once again, it is genius because it's a way of saying, they're coming for you, they're coming for you, they're coming for you, just like when Limbaugh said the only reason Colin Powell voted for Barack Obama was out of racial loyalty, right? What was that? No, because Colin Powell couldn't possibly have made up his own mind and actually decided that was the best vote for him. No, it had to be racial loyalty, which was his way of saying, see, even the ones you thought you could trust, they're coming for you. Right, that's what all this is about. It's about using white anxiety as the country becomes less white. Right? It's about taking this anxiety that comes from the demographic change, from the election of a black president, from an increasingly multicultural pop culture, which really reflects the interwoven nature of America as a multicultural space in ways that even 20 years ago was unheard of. I mean, 25 years ago, MTV wouldn't even play videos by black artists. You know, Michael Jackson was really the only one for a while, and now all of a sudden, you know, American culture is thoroughly multicultural. The posters on our children's walls don't look like us. Oh my God. You know. So all of a sudden, all of this change has scared a lot of people, and people like Beck and Limbaugh sort of give voice to that anxiety and push these buttons of resentment in a way that make it, again, even harder for us to have this conversation. But I want to tell you how dangerous this is, because I think it's very important if we're going to have a conversation about issues of racial privilege and racism and inequality, that you know before that conversation is done, or at least early on in that conversation, how dangerous it is for us to remain oblivious to this, or to ignore it, or to act like it ought not concern us. Obviously, people of color know why it concerns them. I mean, their lives are on the line. But I would argue that, in fact, for those of us who are white, we too, whether we realize it or not, and I realize we often don't, that we too have an interest in challenging this narrative that the right is spinning and this systemic reality that exists, which, even though it benefits us in relative terms, it gives us in the short term greater opportunity and advantages relative to people of color. But in the long run, it is a dysfunctional type of system. Let me just give you a couple of examples of why that's true. Think about this economic meltdown right now, for instance, which we know has been in large part the result of the housing collapse. Now, let's think about the housing collapse and how we got to where we are right now, because if you understand the history of this and how it leads to the present, you can understand how the connection between black and brown pain, on the one hand, and the pain that millions of white folks right now are feeling, as our houses too. You know, we're not able to pay our mortgages in many cases, and we're losing our homes, and you need to understand how those pains are connected, but you can't do that unless you know the history. So let's do a brief little history lesson. So for decades, what banks would do, and I'm sure some of you know this history, but many might not. For decades, there was pretty much a standing policy among most lending institutions that people in certain neighborhoods, particularly low and moderate income black and brown neighborhoods, simply could not get loans, right? They would literally redline entire communities. So they would have a map in the bank, and they would take a red marker, and they would literally circle entire communities, and anybody who lived within the red line could not get a loan for a business, could not get a mortgage, right? Didn't matter what your own credit record was. Didn't matter whether you had a good job or collateral or decent income. Didn't matter whether you paid your bills on time. They didn't care. They just thought, if you live in this neighborhood, you're a bad credit risk, we're not going to loan to you. And theoretically, that was made illegal, but it continued to happen, directly or indirectly. And as a result of redlining, entire neighborhoods, entire census tracts, mostly black and brown, low and moderate income, were starved of needed capital. And what happened after you do that for 20 or 30 years is it makes communities very vulnerable then to what happened next, which was the same banks that would not loan money at a low rate of interest, right, a rate of interest that would have been affordable for people in the community, then came into the community. They had purposely starved of capital, purposely left vulnerable, purposely decimated in order to maintain their own bottom line. They came in and they said, oh, we'll give you loans now, but we're going to charge you double the interest rate that we would have charged you 20 years ago or 5 years ago or 6 months ago, and take advantage of your economic desperation, because we know you want to be part of the American dream, right? You want home ownership, just like that's the cornerstone of the American dream. So you go in to these communities that have been made desperate by their own policies, and you take advantage of them with higher interest rates, what are called subprime or predatory loans, knowing you can rope people in, and they get into it, and you tell them ahead of time, don't worry, before the interest rate really explodes on you, we'll refinance the loan. Don't worry, we can always refinance to keep the cost down, even though they had no intention of refinancing. And so what happened was a lot of folks, millions of people really, got sucked in. Overwhelmingly, they were people of color. And in places like North Carolina, for instance, Citi, which is the subprime lending arm of Citibank, got in a lot of trouble because they were doing this deliberately, giving loans to black families, for instance, at rates of interest that were far higher than what they would have offered to white families who had the same credit history, the same collateral, the same income, right? Ripping them off because they could, getting like $100,000 extra per mortgage out of these folks, right? Millions of dollars just scammed from desperate people. And so what, of course, happens is that by the mid-90s, this isn't really new, that's the thing. A lot of us only heard about it in the last few years when it made the news. But this subprime mortgage scandal and predatory lending has been going on since the early to mid-90s. And it was in the mid-90s that the Congressional Black Caucus, people like Maxine Waters and a handful of other community-based organizations led by people of color were raising the alarm bell about this. And you know what? Nobody wanted to deal with it. Right? Democrat or Republican. Nobody really wanted to talk about it. Bill Clinton didn't want to talk about it any more than Bob Dole wanted to talk about it in '96, right? And George W. Bush didn't want to talk about it, neither did Al Gore. I mean, really nobody in 2000 wanted to talk about it. Didn't matter what party you were in. Everybody sort of had this attitude of, oh, well, you know, that's a shame, but it doesn't really affect Main Street, you know, which is this euphemism. You know where Main Street is, right? It's located in that part of town where Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard is not located, right? And vice versa. So ultimately, it wasn't hitting white people. So people didn't think about it. It wasn't a winning issue, so nobody took it up. Democrat or Republican, liberal or conservative, really, right? And so what happened is the lenders looked around by the early 2000s, and you know what they said? They said, oh my God, they're not going to stop us, right? They're not going to regulate us. In fact, there was this intense deregulation of the lending industry, particularly independent mortgage brokers during this time. So banks, there were still regulations on what banks could do, but these independent mortgage brokers who didn't have hardly any regulation started writing all these loans. And they didn't just stay in the hood, man. They didn't just stay in black and brown low-income space. They were like, hell, we'll go out to the suburbs now, right? Because there's money to be made out there. We'll go out to the exurbs. You know what the exurbs are, right? Exurbs are like that whole new geographic space that white folks carved out when we decided the suburbs were too brown, right? When we decided, we were shocked to learn that black folks liked Olive Garden too, right? And so then we're like, damn, we have to create a whole nother ring of stuff, and we'll just call that the exurbs, you know, and then banks were like, cool, we can go out there. Lending institutions, independent mortgage brokers, like, we can go out there, and they did. And so right now, two of the hardest hit communities in this country for subprime loan foreclosures are what? Nassau and Suffolk County. That's Long Island. These are overwhelmingly white middle-class spaces. And the irony of this, right, is that if we had cared about that pain 20 years ago and 15 years ago, when it was black and brown pain, we might have done something. But because we didn't, because we had the privilege, those of us who were white, of thinking this isn't about us, we didn't regulate that industry, and the independent mortgage brokers had no incentive to do right by people, because the thing about the independent mortgage brokers is they write you a loan, right? They get you the loan, and then they sell the loan before the ink is even dry on the paperwork. So if they're going to turn around and sell the loan, they don't care if 3 years later you go belly up and your house gets foreclosed on. They already got their commission. They got paid. They don't come back and take that from them if you foreclose. They already got paid. There was no incentive for them to do right by people. They could rip them off with impunity, and the government did nothing about it. So much for the heavy hand of government regulation. It was exactly the opposite during this period of time. And so now the irony is the whole economy is imploding around us, in part because of our indifference to black and brown suffering a decade and a half to 2 decades ago. What does that tell us? Black and brown pain and white pain are connected. Millions of white families right now suffering precisely because we had the privilege of ignoring the issue, because we didn't think it was about us. Same thing with unemployment. You know, right now, white Americans are like freaking out because we're looking at double-digit unemployment. Oh my God. Well, yeah, that is frightening, but it's not new for everybody. Double-digit unemployment isn't new for black people. It's not new for Latino folk. It's not new for indigenous Native North American folk. It's been the norm most every year since they started keeping records on this stuff. But again, what's the irony? White folks haven't had this level of economic insecurity since the Great Depression. So we became sort of inured to the suffering of other people. We became convinced it wasn't going to be a problem, and so we didn't do anything about it. Black teenage unemployment hit 42% back like 9 years ago. Nobody called for a stimulus bill then. Nobody called for economic bailouts then. Nobody called for congressional hearings then. Nobody talked about anything then because the attitude was, well, it's their own damn fault. If they don't have a job, they just don't have the right work ethic. Now you see how that attitude has spread now. Now it's starting to affect white folks. There was a Newsweek article back in the spring. It was really heavy, like front page article, right, about white-collar white folks, not even blue-collar white folks. Blue-collar white folks have been getting hammered for 35 years just like black and brown folks. Not as badly, but still badly, ever since the manufacturing sector in our country has gone into decline. But this was a story about like affluent CEO-type white-collar white guys who have been laid off, and they didn't know what to do. And like now it's a national crisis because they're losing their jobs, so now we need to be concerned, you know? And I'm sympathetic to these people because, look, they got families too. And I'm sympathetic to anybody who's struggling and trying to support their family and they don't have work, but it was really telling, this article, because if you read the article, this is like back in April, I think, there's this one white guy who was like a CFO or CEO of a company, major company, right? And he quit his job because he was just so sure that his winning resume would be able to help him find a new job. That's how cocky and confident and entitled he was. And then he hadn't gotten a job for like 6 months, and so now he can't make his house payments, and he's talking about how when he goes out looking for work, he feels like there's a neon sign around his neck that says, unemployed bum. These were his words. And I thought to myself, wow, that's pretty deep. Because where did that narrative come from, that unemployed people were bums? Why would he feel that way? Is that the way we felt about unemployed people in the 30s during the Depression? Well, I guess maybe some rich people felt that way, but most Americans knew better, right? Most Americans knew there were structural economic conditions that explain that. But what's happened in the last 40 years is we have constructed a narrative, and you know it is racial. You know it is racial, that has made us believe that if you're out of work, it's your own fault. And what's interesting is that narrative wasn't created by black folk. It wasn't created by Latino folk. It wasn't created by poor white folk. You know who created that narrative? You know who crafted it? You know who turned it into a political weapon? Guys like this dude who now is paying the price for the very narrative that he created and people like him created. Now that is irony. Here's a guy who is suffering precisely because all of these years people like him said, cut those safety net programs. That's for lazy people. Unemployment insurance, that makes you lazy. We got Congress people saying that now, running around saying that we ought to cut unemployment benefits because it makes you lazy. A, you already paid for those. That came out of your paycheck every week that you had a job, so you are entitled to them by definition. They've already been paid for. And B, more importantly perhaps, is this idea that how in the world could anybody really believe that unemployment insurance would make you lazy? Do you really think that anybody wants to sit around and collect, what, $200 a week on average, rather than get a job that can allow them to support their families? What kind of hatred of human beings do we really have that we believe that about them? Well, I'll tell you the kind. It's the kind that for 4 decades has been cultivated by politicians in this country in order to bash poor folks, in order to get votes from people who are not poor by making them feel like they're better than other people. Because after all, if you're out of work, you know it's your own fault. Once again, that indifference that we've allowed, all of us have allowed, to be such a prominent part of our political system and our political narrative is now coming back to haunt the very people who created it. So you see, privilege and inequality can actually set you up. It makes you believe. I mean, I got this email from this guy like a year ago, and it was really a very heavy email. He writes to me, white guy, right? And he had read some article I'd written about white privilege. He was very mad at me because he said, you know, he said, I understand you're probably right, generally speaking. I'm sure that people of color face racism. I'm sure that those of us who are white do have advantages. But he said, honestly, I've been out of work for like 26 weeks, man, so I got to tell you, I don't feel really privileged. And I said, hey, I get that, man. And we engaged in a really, I think, productive conversation. I think he felt it too. By the time it was over, I said, I understand your situation is terrible, and if there was anything I could do for you, man, I would. Like, if I had a job to offer you, I would. If I knew somebody to like connect you to in your particular industry, I would. I said, unfortunately, I don't have that for you. So I understand that you're in a bad place. He was talking about he had to raid his kids' college funds, and he had to cash out his 401k retirement plan, and he was desperate. And so he didn't feel privileged, even though he knew that the larger structure was one that was unequal. He was willing to acknowledge that much, but he said, hey, right now, I'm not getting a lot of goodies out of being this white man. I said, I understand that. I said, I don't have a job to offer you, money to offer you, connections to offer you. All I can offer you is an analysis, and it may or may not help you, but it's all I got. So I hope you will take it in the spirit that it's intended. I said, when you wrote to me, I found it really interesting. One of the things he said was really sort of stood out in his email was he said, this wasn't supposed to happen to me. He said, I did everything right. I played by the rules. I went to college. I worked hard. I came in early and I stayed late. I did everything that they asked of me. This wasn't supposed to happen. Now, on the one hand, I'm sympathetic. On the other hand, there's a lot of entitlement wrapped up in that, right? Because what he's really saying, the implicit subtext is, it was supposed to happen to those other poor schlubs on the unemployment line, but not me. I did everything right. They didn't. They're lazy. They don't have the right work ethic. They don't have the right values, but not me. What's the irony? Once again, like he didn't realize this whole narrative that has been constructed, which he probably never thought twice about until it hit him, has created a situation where he was able to believe that all it took was hard work. Now, see, that's white privilege. If we want to understand what privilege is, I'm not even talking about it as a material condition. Forget that for a minute. I'm talking about it as a psychological condition, right? White privilege allowed this white man to believe that all it took was hard work, because there isn't a person of color in this country who has been awake for even a minute and has reached even like teenage years who believes that all it takes is hard work. Folks of color know better than that. Hell, for that matter, women of all colors know better than that. Working class and poor folks of all races know that hard work has never been enough. Only white middle class men, frankly, have the luxury of believing that mythology. That's the danger of privilege. It sets you up to accept a certain image of your country that isn't accurate. Then when you find out that it's actually more complicated than that, you're not ready for reality. It's a very dangerous place, because this guy now is not just suffering the material conditions that come with like income insecurity and food and healthcare insecurity and housing insecurity. He's dealing with the psychological trauma of coming to realize that his country is not what he thought it was. Notice folk of color not freaking out about that. Folk of color sort of knew. It's like the guy, I remember after the O.J. trial, I know there have been a couple of them, so let's go back to the first one. The first O.J. Simpson trial, 94, 95, and he's acquitted of murder, in October of 1995, and white folk lost our minds, And there was this one dude on CNN, he was just so angry about this acquittal of O.J. Simpson. I remember watching him on TV, and tears are like just streaming down his face, man. He was like, oh my God. Now I realize that everything they told me in the 3rd grade about this country having the greatest justice system imaginable was all a lie. Now he had figured it out. Dude was like 35. If he had known any black or brown folk, they could have set him straight by the time he was 11 about how not perfect the system was, but he'd had the luxury of believing it, and now he had concluded that the only imperfection in the system was that O.J. walked. That was the imperfection. You see, when you have privilege, you have the luxury of believing things are like X, and when you find out they're like Y, you're not ready. It's sort of this weird thing about people who have been marginalized and oppressed actually end up having a much clearer vision in many ways about the society. It's not to romanticize suffering or to say there's any nobility that is born from it. It's just to say that you get a clarity of vision. And those of us in the dominant group, we have a lens that we don't even realize is there, right? So it's like with 9/11. I'm just going to say this, and it's going to piss some folks off. Last night, somebody actually got up and left. I hope that doesn't happen, but I have to tell you what I have to tell you. So 9/11 happens, and I remember that was a horrible, tragic, awful day. And many of us probably know folks who died. I do, and I'm sure many of you do. But here's the deal. What I found fascinating about that day was the news coverage, and when they asked people about it, I remember there were lots of people, they would get, microphones shoved in their face, and they would, sort of offer their take on it. And then in the weeks and the months afterward, I remember going to college campuses and giving speeches, and people would ask the same question. They would get up and they would ask this question: Why do people hate us? Why do people hate the United States? Now, here's the thing about that question. I saw it asked hundreds of times. If I saw it once, I never saw it asked by a person of color even one time. And I dare you to find any coverage in any news station, local or national, where any person of color ever stood in front of a microphone and asked that question: why would anyone hate the United States of America? Why? And it's not because people of color are less sensitive. It's not because they were any less afraid or horrified. It is because, very simply, to be a person of color is to have to know what other people think about you, because your life depends on that. To be a member of the dominant group is to have the luxury of being in a bubble of our own innocence and our own naivete, not having to know anything about anybody. So we get to assume that everybody sees us the way we see us. And then we're shocked to learn that that isn't the case. We're shocked to learn that maybe there are folks who don't feel about this country the way that we have been led to believe about it and to feel about it. Why would anyone hate us? We never did anything to anybody. We've done nothing but spread goodness and light all around the planet. Well, people all around the planet know that that isn't accurate, and people of color in this country surely know it isn't. Many of them wouldn't even be here were it not for a slightly different history than goodness and light being spread around the world. But we've had the luxury of believing it, and so 9/11 happens, and privileged people don't know what to do. They're like, oh my God, what is this? Oh, we got to come up with a reason. What's a good reason? I know. They hate us because of our freedoms. Really? Because of our freedom? What is that? That's like your mother telling you when you're getting teased when you're like 5 that the reason people are picking on you is because they're just jealous. My mom used to tell me that. I used to have like really big, long, like white boy afro hair. And people would give me all kinds of crap for it, and my mom would say, they're just jealous. No, they didn't want my hair. They just didn't like me. They weren't jealous. They didn't want that mess that I was carrying around. That was not jealousy. So people say, they just hate us because we're so free. They just hate us because of our freedoms. And that was a privileged answer, because only privileged people have the luxury of thinking they're free. Do you think they went to Washington Heights, the South Bronx? Do you think they went to Pine Ridge Reservation and talked to the Lakota peoples about this and asked the Lakota, like, hey, why did 9/11 happen? No, they didn't ask that, because the Lakota were not going to say, well, damn fool, look around. It's obviously all these freedoms we have. It was a white answer. They didn't even go to Appalachia and ask poor white folks, because they wouldn't have gotten that answer from them either. They only asked white middle class and above folks who couldn't figure it out. So then we decided we got to go read a book like Islam for Dummies so we understand why they're doing this to us. That will help us understand, right? This is really dangerous, because it means you don't actually interrogate the reason for folks' beliefs. I'm not suggesting that any reason that someone could hate this country would justify killing 3,000 innocent people. It's not to justify the action. There's a difference between an explanation and an excuse, right? An explanation and a legitimate rationale. It's not legitimate to kill 3,000 people just because you hate the country or the leadership of that country. By the same token, it's not legitimate to go kill 100,000 innocent civilians in response, which is what we have done, right? That isn't legitimate either. But mostly in a country that had nothing to do with the attack in the first place, making it even more criminal. But that's the problem with privilege, is we don't think about that. And the same thing happens on a college campus. Like, we can't have legitimate conversations when we're not willing to acknowledge that we all have a different lens, you know? And it's not about being good people or bad people. I think most people are good people. I think most people are good people trying to do the right thing. I really do believe that. But I think the problem is it's really hard to know what the right thing is when you don't see how your own vision is sort of limited by your identity status and what you are encouraged to see versus what you're not encouraged to see. So like if you go back to the early 60s, look at the Gallup poll, found that in 1962, at a time when we were still a formal system of white supremacy, for goodness sake, about 90% of white folks said that black kids had an equal educational opportunity with white kids. Even in 62, like 90%, 87%, almost 9 out of 10 whites believed that, right? Now that looks delusional in retrospect. With the benefit of like half a century in the past, you can go, my God, how could they believe that? But here's the deal. This is really the sick fact. It's not because they were bad people. It's not because they were just like inherently stupid or incapable of, like unevolved, incapable of seeing the truth. It's not that. The really scary thing is that those were mostly good people, mostly functional human beings, mostly decent and probably caring and compassionate people who still did not know the truth. And the reason they didn't know the truth is because they didn't have to know the truth. Because there was no penalty for being ignorant about the experiences of the millions of black and brown brothers and sisters that you share the country with in 1962. And I would dare say there's no punishment today for not knowing that. Nothing has changed in that regard. If you're white, you can remain stone cold ignorant about the experiences of people of color. And what's going to happen to you? Nothing. It's not on the test. And what I mean by that is any job you want, think about it, whatever career you're interested in having, is there any career you can actually name where in order to be deemed competent for that career, you're going to have to demonstrate knowledge about the experiences of people of color, even in that very field? No. If you want to be a teacher, for instance, in a black and brown community, I know a lot of y'all are education majors, right? You want to be a teacher in a black or brown space. Are you going to, as a condition of being deemed competent to get that job, are you going to be required to pass some kind of an exam that demonstrates that you have any knowledge about the people in those classrooms, the families in that community, or the historic relationship of those families and those individuals to the educational system? No, you are not. In fact, you know what? Not only will you not have to demonstrate that you know anything about them, folks will pat you on the back just being for so noble to go in there in the first place. My goodness, aren't you noble and caring and compassionate and wonderful for being willing to go into that space and teach those poor, benighted souls? You won't have to demonstrate that you know anything about them. You'll actually be given like a pat on the back just for being willing to do it. That is how little we care about the people whom we're claiming to educate. We don't have to know them. You want to be a social worker, a police officer, you want to be a business owner in that community, you want to be a doctor, a physician in a black or brown space. Do you have to demonstrate that you know anything about the historic relationship of that community to the healthcare delivery system, which, if you know the history, you know is a very torturous one indeed? There's a lot of reasons why black and brown folk don't trust the medical establishment. But if I want to be a doctor in that community, I'm not going to have to demonstrate that I know anything about that. In fact, once again, people will pat me on the back just for being willing to go in there and serve that community. That's a problem. We as white folks don't have to know black and brown truth, and we can still be considered competent. Now, ask yourself, can any person of color in this country be deemed competent in any job that they want if they don't learn white folks stuff? Oh, no. No. People of color will have to learn our stuff. They will have to learn what we've decided is important. They will have to learn white literature, white theater, white poetry, white art. I know we don't call it that. That would be the point, right? When your stuff is the norm, when your stuff is the stuff against which everybody else's stuff gets compared and is usually found to be wanting by comparison, to be lacking by comparison, you don't have to designate the racial origin of your own stuff. You don't have to call it white literature. You just call it literature, theater, poetry, art. This, for those who were unclear, let's clear it up before February comes around and we have to have this conversation again. This would be why we don't have White History Month, because we have several of them. They just happen to go by the tricky names that we've given them so as to cover up that fact. Names like May, June, July, and August, September, and pretty much any other month that we have it designated for somebody else, that will be ours. But the dominant group doesn't have to think about that. And once again, here's the really sad thing. It's not because we're bad people that we don't think about it. It's like, this is the way privilege is, and I'm glad you all are doing a longer series about lots of different kinds of privilege because they're all extremely important. And what's interesting is every one of us in this room has got some kind of privilege. Some of us more than others, right? But everybody in here's got some, and it's important for us to own that piece that we have. Like, first of all, if you're in college, you have privilege, by definition, relative to the vast majority of people on the planet. So that's number one, right? Regardless of racial identity, class identity. It's the fact that you're here or in any of the schools that you happen to attend, because I know not everybody is at this institution. But there are others as well. Like, you may not have racial privilege, but you may have class privilege. You may not have class privilege, but you may have gender privilege. You may not have gender privilege, but you may have straight privilege or cisgendered privilege, which is, and for those who don't know the term, right, the opposite of transgendered folks. So, or you may not have any of those, but you're able-bodied, right? And so just on that level, I mean, think about that for a second. Like, for those of you who are able-bodied, and as I look out into the crowd, it appears that most of you would fit into that category, though I obviously can't know for sure, but I think it's probably fair to say the overwhelming majority of us are, at least temporarily so, because if we live long enough, the odds are pretty good that we will have some kind of disability or infirmity. But here's the point, like, as an able-bodied person, did you really pay close attention to, like, how you got into the building today, or how you're going to get out if there was a fire, and oh my God, is there a ramp, and if not, you know, how steep are the steps, and how long does it take to get from wherever you were before you came here to here? Do you have time? Did you leave enough time to get there? Those are the kind of things that people with disabilities have to think about, right, as they plan their day, their week, their month, their life. That is the kind of psychological weight that people with disabilities have that able-bodied people don't have. And the fact that we don't think about that, those of us who are able-bodied, doesn't make us bad people, right? It doesn't make us, like, intentionally oppressive to the disabled, right? It's not that. It's just that we have the luxury of having one less thing to think about. And when you have the luxury of one less thing to think about, or for some of us, 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 less things to think about, that gives you a psychological edge, and that translates to a material advantage in the job market, in the schools, right? For those of us who are white, not worried that if we answer a question incorrectly in class and we get it, we get the answer wrong, that people are going to think it's because of some racial flaw, right? Because there is no stereotype about white intelligence that's negative. So if we blow it, right, as white folks, that doesn't stick to us as white folks. People of color know that that's a burden that they carry. They didn't just drop the ball for themselves. They might be dropping it for everybody that looks like them. Now, women on a gender level and sex level know what that is, because if women are in a class, particularly in a discipline where they're underrepresented, like advanced science or math discipline curriculum, there are a lot of studies which have found that women oftentimes in those classes will not participate as actively in the classroom discussions, not because they don't know the material, not because they're not capable, but because they know that if they answer questions incorrectly or underperform, there might be people who ascribe their performance to some group-based defect. So that's male privilege to not have to deal with that, right? These are the kind of things that I hope we can think about, because as we're trying to create community, colleges are these weird places now. I mean, 100 years ago, maybe, colleges weren't this way, because 100 years ago, colleges were pretty much, the preserve of rich white men. There were obviously women's colleges and there were HBCUs, but overwhelmingly, higher education was the exclusive preserve of highly privileged rich white men. Now, schools are trying to be something different, at least in theory, right? They're trying to create community out of all these disparate parts, right? Folks who have different racial, ethnic, cultural, geographic, linguistic, religious, whatever, backgrounds. And that's not a natural thing to have happen. If it were natural, we wouldn't have to go to such effort to make it happen, right? 85% of white Americans live in communities where there are almost no people of color around. So we come to college and we're like amazed by how diverse it is, right? And black and brown folk are like, for real? Because y'all haven't been out much. If you think this is diverse, like y'all really don't know what you're talking about, because their frame says this is like the whitest place some of them have been. And for us, it's like the most diverse place. And see, that's an interesting thing. And it's not that either group is right. Each group has got its lens, right? We're all coming from this very racialized space. The key to creating that community that this school, like a lot of others, is trying to create, so that these climate assessments that we do, like I know y'all have just gone through recently, have a different result the next time. It's going to require that we are willing to own our lens. Right? Folks of color know they've got a lens. They know that their perceptions of the world are shaped by their identity. How could they not know it? Right? Working class and low income folks, even if you're white, you know that your identity shapes your understanding of the world, your understanding of the economy, your understanding of the society. LGBT folks know, right? Women generally also know on a gender and sex level that that's true. But for those of us in dominant groups on any of those different, identities that I just mentioned, a lot of times we don't realize we have a lens as well. We just think that race is what people of color have, not realizing that you can't have a down without an up. If some folks are down, other folks are up by definition. These are relative concepts. Some people have less opportunity, other folks have more. If some people have more to think about, other folks have less to think about. That's just the way it works. If we're willing to own our piece of it, we can create community in these spaces. If we're willing the next time this comes up in a classroom to realize this radical lesson, this is the most important lesson, and it sounds so basic, but it must be radical that we'd have already done.